November 18, 1944, west of the Huichen Forest. The German 116th Panzer Division was dug in tight along the muddy tree line of a shattered farm village south of Düren. They had 3 Panzer IVs, 2 SD, KFZ, 251 half-tracks, a concrete pillbox, and orders from Army Group B to hold the road until reinforcements arrived. That morning, a cold mist crawled in over the broken fields, covering barbed wire and frozen mud. Lieutenant Hans Eberhardt stood atop the bunker's firing slit, scanning the fog with a pair of Zeiss binoculars. All was quiet. His tank crews were inside their panzers with the heaters off to preserve fuel. The machine gunners smoked in silence. Munitions had been rationed to 3 belts per MG-42. They had enough 75 shells for 34 shots total between all tanks. And yet they were confident. No Sherman could survive a direct hit from a Panzer IV's long-barreled cannon. No Allied infantry dared charge a bunker supported by overlapping machine gun arcs and armored vehicles. So when Eberhardt heard the low, dull thunk in the fog, he thought it was an engine misfiring, maybe a distant mortar. Then the side armor of the nearest half-track disappeared in a flash of orange. No screeching shell, no distant artillery, just a sudden roar of shaped flame and pressure, and the half-track folded inward like a beer can under a boot. His men shouted. The fog lit up with more thunkes, each followed by an eruption of steel and fire. Another blast tore the upper plate off a bunker vent. A second SD, KFZ, vehicle burst into flame. And that's when Eberhardt realized this wasn't artillery, this wasn't armor, this was American infantry, and they were carrying weapons that shouldn't have been able to do this. The word came down from a screaming corporal, scrambling over the frozen dirt. "Panzer Faust," Eberhardt demanded. "No, sir," the corporal gasped. "Bazookas." They weren't just anti-tank. They were cracking bunkers. Private First Class Jimmy Ward was a Missouri farm boy who hadn't known a thing about shaped charges until the week before. Now he was carrying a 2-foot steel tube with a bell-shaped warhead and 7 pounds of concentrated firepower. His squad had spent the night crawling through freezing drainage ditches toward the German line, and now he stood 20 yards from a dug-in position that was supposed to be impervious to rifles or grenades. The 2.36-inch M1A1 rocket launcher, the Bazooka, had changed since Tunisia. It didn't jam as often, it fired hotter, and its new heat warhead could do something no rifle grenade ever could. It could punch through 100 m of armor, no matter the angle. Ward aimed it at the bunker slit. He squeezed the trigger. The rocket whooshed forward, a short flame tail streaking into the cold fog. There was no screech, no arc. It moved like a punch from God. The concrete cracked, a glowing fist of orange fire blowing through the slit and folding the gunner backward. The machine gun stopped. Ward reloaded. The second shot slammed into the corner of a support wall. It didn't collapse, but the roof of the bunker shifted an inch and dust began to pour through the seams. That was enough. The infantry behind him roared forward, pouring bar and Garand fire into the stunned opening. By the time they reached the door, the Germans inside were coughing, half-deaf, bleeding from their ears, hands up. They had no idea that a man on foot could do that. Eberhardt ordered the panzers forward. They rumbled out of cover, engines groaning against the churned soil. Infantry formed up behind them, hoping to push the Americans back across the hedgerows. That was when the third half-track exploded. This time, Eberhardt saw it with his own eyes, a flash from the mist, a silent streak across 30 meters of dead air, then a sudden blast that lifted the vehicle's wheels clean off the ground before dumping the twisted wreckage back into the earth. He shouted for suppressing fire. The MG-42s opened up, sawing through hedgerow and earth, but it was blind, desperate. A second rocket slammed into the turret ring of Panzer IV-2. The armor plate peeled open like an apple skin. Eberhart felt cold. Not fear, not yet, just cold. Because this wasn't how it was supposed to go. Ward's squad broke left, ducking into a shallow crater and firing from behind a smoldering tree stump. The bazooka had a backblast that could kill a man if he stood too close. The trick was to kneel, clear your six, fire, and move. They were down to 4 rounds. Corporal Levin reloaded one and handed it off. "Pick the engine deck," he said. Ward nodded, bracing the launcher over the edge of the crater. The Panzer's turret was turning toward a machine gun nest they'd just overrun. He fired. The rocket struck just above the tracks into the engine bay. The tank didn't explode, it just stopped. Smoke poured from the vents. The turret froze mid-turn. Ward whispered, "We'll take that." In the German lines, confusion reigned. The assumption had always been that infantry carried rifles, maybe grenades. Bazookas were weak, mostly good for tank destroyers and desperation. But this was different. These bazookas weren't chipping paint. They were killing armor. They were cracking reinforced concrete. Oberfeldwebel Gruber stood inside the pillbox that had once served as a supply point. A blast had torn half its door away. Through the wreckage, he saw American shapes moving, small, fast, crouched. They were too close for artillery, too low for the tanks to angle. He turned to his men. "They're coming through with rockets." "What kind?" a gunner asked. "American," he said, "and that's all that matters." The remaining Panzer pulled back toward the tree line. Eberhart jumped from the forward command post, his boots crunching frozen mud. Every second counted now. His division was bleeding tanks and morale, not from aircraft, not from artillery, but from squads of infantry that should have been no threat at all. He knelt behind the loader's hatch and scanned the fog. No Shermans, no Stuarts, just movement, shadows of American GIs moving through the smoke like ghosts. And always that sound, a thump, a streak, then an eruption. He knew now that they were being dismantled, not by armor, but by a weapon they had dismissed. The Americans had found a new way to kill tanks, and it walked on 2 legs. The tank didn't burn. It just stopped moving. Smoke belched from its engine deck, hissing against the cold mud as the surviving crew scrambled out, hands raised, some dragging the wounded, others blinking at the fog like they just emerged from another world. To Lieutenant Hans Eberhart, that was worse than fire. A burning tank was chaos, explosions, screams. But this was surgical. A single man, maybe 2, with a shoulder-fired weapon had shut down a Panzer IV as cleanly as if he'd unplugged it from the battlefield. No artillery coordination, no anti-tank gun emplacement, no armor-piercing aircraft. Just one man with a tube and a rocket. The battlefield had changed, and no one had warned him. He ordered the remaining MG-42 teams to shift fire to the flanks, praying to catch one of the American rocketeers between shots. The fog thickened. It ate sound, muted distance, and when they saw shadows through it, the gunner opened fire. But it was a scarecrow, a helmet on a shovel placed just right. The real squad had already moved. Another thump echoed, and the nearest bunker's entrance vanished in fire and smoke. Jimmy Ward's shoulder ached. The bazooka wasn't heavy, but after crawling, firing, reloading, and hauling it through the muck for hours, it felt like lifting a concrete beam. He crouched next to a collapsed wall, watching the smoke roll out of the last concrete bunker at the edge of the road junction. The blast hadn't cracked the whole thing, but it had broken the door. His squad's fire team had already tossed grenades inside. What came out was surrender. One by one, stunned Germans staggered out, disarmed and bleeding from the ears. Some had shell shock. Others just looked stunned, not from the blast, but from the realization. The Americans weren't supposed to do this. Infantry didn't kill tanks. Infantry didn't crack bunkers. And yet here they were. 2 kilometers east, a pair of American engineers worked under cover of a barn. unpacking more of the new heat, high-explosive anti-tank rounds from wooden crates. These weren't designed to shatter by impact, like traditional explosives. They created a focused jet of molten copper that punched through armor with physics, not brute force. The warhead's cone shape was a secret no longer. The Germans had something similar with their Panzerfaust, but they didn't expect the Americans to field it in numbers, or with such accuracy. Sergeant Rizzo checked the box. 14 rockets left, enough for a full platoon push on the western hill. The bazooka wasn't perfect. It had a backblast. It needed time to reload. It couldn't fire from inside buildings. But in the open, at 40 yards or less with a steady hand, it was death. Oberfeldwebel Gruber tried to mount a counterattack. 2 squads of Wehrmacht infantry began to fan out across a rise overlooking the smoking road. They had rifle grenades and MG-34 support. In his mind, he pictured them pinning the American infantry, giving time for the last panzer to reposition. Then one of the Americans fired uphill. The rocket lanced through the air, not at a tank, but into the base of a small brick shed near the German line. There had been no soldiers in it, but there had been ammo. The explosion ripped through the slope like a mine. Earth, splinters, and limbs flew skyward. The soldiers didn't advance. They scattered. Some ran. Some dropped and crawled. The squad cohesion, already frayed from exhaustion and cold, simply collapsed. Not because of what they saw, but because of what they now understood. Eberhardt didn't panic. Not yet. He barked orders, ordered smoke shells from the last 75, told the flanking riflemen to move up and try to spot the launcher teams. He kept repeating a single sentence to himself, over and over, to keep the fear down. It's just infantry. It's just infantry. But it was. American bazooka teams didn't charge. They approached, slowly, patiently. They moved like predators, fire, shift, reload, disappear. The terrain wasn't cover, it was part of the weapon. The last panzer finally repositioned. It wheeled left, engine whining, turret scanning. The gunner spotted an American position, elevated just above a pile of rubble. Before they could fire, the side armor erupted. The rocket had come from the church bell tower. The loader inside the tank died instantly. The commander bilayed out, his uniform on fire, his sidearm forgotten in the mud. By the time the MG teams turned their fire toward the tower, the Americans were already gone. By mid-afternoon, the German defense was in pieces, not from a massive artillery barrage, not from dive bombers, but from a methodical erosion of everything they had relied on: armor, fixed positions, overlapping machine guns. Each tool had been neutralized by a 2-man team, carrying a weapon that weighed less than an MG-42 and cost a fraction of a tank tread. In less than 3 hours, the line had lost 3 vehicles, 2 bunkers, and nearly 80 men. American casualties were under 20. Private Ward sat behind a crater's lip, wiping mud from his face with a sleeve. The bazooka lay across his lap, still warm from the last shot. He wasn't proud, he wasn't gloating, he was tired. The last few Germans had surrendered, hands shaking, faces blank. One of them, a Panzer crewman no older than Ward himself, had muttered something as he handed over his helmet. Ward didn't speak German, but he heard the word bunker, then rocket, then a quiet how. He didn't answer. What could he say? He didn't invent the bazooka, he just carried it. But it had become the difference between pushing forward and being turned into meat on barbed wire. Behind the line, an American captain wrote the report. It would be forwarded to battalion command by nightfall. Enemy resistance broken at Junction 12. 1 panzer destroyed by infantry rocket team. 2 bunkers penetrated and cleared. Bazooka units effective beyond expectation. There was a footnote in his handwriting. Recommend increasing heat rocket issue. Infantry now capable of anti-armor and fortification breach at squad level. He underlined that last part twice. That was the part that would change doctrine. In the evening frost, Eberhart walked the smoking ruins of the position he'd been ordered to hold. He counted the bodies. He tried not to look at the wrecked tank hulls. What haunted him most wasn't defeat. He'd seen retreat before. What haunted him was the knowledge that no one had told them this was possible. That the rules had changed. That the infantryman now carried the equivalent of a direct-fire artillery shell on his shoulder, and he could aim it wherever he liked. No trench was safe. No vehicle was safe. No bunker was safe. Not anymore. 2 days after the fight near the Huichin Junction, the road to Eschweiler was declared clear of armor, not by Sherman tanks, but by rifle squads and engineers. What had once required divisional coordination and artillery now took 6 men, 3 bazookas, and ammunition crates dragged by hand. The American advance didn't stall, it accelerated. Roads previously considered suicide corridors for infantry became hunting grounds. Columns of German vehicles, once confident in their armored superiority, now traveled with paranoia. The problem wasn't numbers. The Wehrmacht still had tanks, still had men. The problem was this. They had no answer for a man with a tube who could put a rocket into a pillbox slit at 30 yards. Lieutenant Hans Eberhart watched the village of Langerwehe from the steeple of a church, its walls cracked by previous shelling, its floors covered in broken pews and shattered glass. Below him, what remained of his motorized infantry platoon was digging hasty trenches in the frostbitten soil, laying wire, placing sandbags. But no one wanted to go near the half-tracks. They had seen what happened to vehicles in the open. One rocket. That was all it took. No explosion, no dramatic Hollywood fireball, just a crack, a hole the size of a helmet, and then silence. It was silence that frightened the Germans more than anything. In the old days, anti-tank fire was unmistakable. Whistles, thunder, impact, flames. Now they heard only a hiss and then death. Private First Class Jimmy Ward knelt behind a rock wall overlooking the outskirts of the village. He adjusted the sling on his bazooka, letting it settle across his shoulder. Corporal Levin crouched beside him with the loader tube and 2 spare rounds. "They'll see us if we move into the open," Levin muttered. "They don't need to see us," Ward said. "We need to hear the treads." There it was, faint at first, then clearer, the groan of armor. A Panzer IV was maneuvering into position behind a farmhouse. Ward knew the rhythm now. They didn't charge anymore. They tried to reverse into fire positions, nose down, hiding their vulnerable engine decks. Smart. But it didn't matter. He raised the launcher. The house was nearly 80 yards away. Long shot. Wind wasn't bad. He adjusted. Firing. The rocket whooshed forward, a comet of light in the cold gray morning. It struck the corner of the stone wall beside the tank. Not a direct hit, but close enough. The overpressure cracked the treads. The tank twisted as if kicked by a giant boot, stuck. The turret jerked, then stopped. Ward's second shot hit square into the side plate. The armor shattered inward. The crew didn't come out. The rifle squad advanced past the burning chassis 10 minutes later. Ward barely glanced at it. He was already moving toward the next street, bazooka low, eyes scanning every doorway. The weapon no longer felt experimental. It felt natural. Captain Reinhardt of the 9th Panzer Lehr sat in the back of a Kubelwagen staring at the daily report. It was worse than bad. It was impossible. 2 armored cars destroyed south of Weissweiler. 1 self-propelled gun disabled in a forest pass. 3 pillboxes abandoned after direct hits to the slits. No artillery, no tanks. Bazookas, the report said, confirmed American infantry with heat capability in all sectors. Reinhardt crushed the paper in his hand. They had dismissed the threat at first, a minor concern, exaggerated. They'd even joked about it. The American pipe, they called it. But now, half their forward positions had been turned into burial sites for men who never saw their killer. On the edge of the town of Gresinish, German troops reinforced a crossroads bunker with sandbags and rails. Inside, Sergeant Klaus Berger wiped sweat from his forehead and glanced at the corner-mounted periscope. Nothing moved. Then came the thunk. He barely had time to blink. The shaped charge struck the seam between two concrete slabs. The overpressure forced flame down the corridor. Men screamed. Berger clawed his way to the rear hatch, only to find it warped shut. Outside, American infantry moved forward, rifles low. The second bazooka round struck 5 feet from the first. The bunker split open. By now, American GIs were naming their bazookas: Betsy, the ex-wife, Slammer. Some painted kill marks on the tubes. Others didn't bother. The weapon's impact spoke for itself. Engineers began requesting dedicated rocket carriers. Some squads carried more rockets than grenades. Even officers who had once called the launcher inaccurate were now issuing standing orders. 2 per platoon minimum, 3 preferred, load heat, target bunkers and light armor on site. The doctrine had changed in 3 weeks. In a field hospital east of Stahlberg, Oberleutnant Friedrich Naumann sat upright, shoulder bandaged, his arm in a sling. His panzer crew had taken a rocket through the side while supporting a retreat. Only he and the driver survived. He spoke quietly to a medic nearby. They weren't even hiding. One stepped out from behind a hay bale, fired, hit, gone like a ghost. He looked down at his bandaged wrist. "I've been through Normandy, seen Shermans with flamethrowers, thunderbolts dropping bombs. I was never afraid." The medic said nothing. Naumann's voice dropped to a whisper. "But this, one man can decide a tank's death now. That's not war, that's execution." In an American command tent near the village of Lammersdorf, intelligence officers spread aerial recon photos across a map. Major Connolly pointed at the markings. "German armor has shifted west, avoiding fixed positions. They're moving under trees only at night." A lieutenant asked, "Fear of artillery?" Connolly shook his head, "Fear of infantry." No one spoke for a moment. The irony hung heavy. For years, armor had ruled the battlefield. Infantry moved behind tanks, took cover behind bunkers, waited for engineers to clear the path. Now, infantry led, and behind them nothing remained. That night, Eberhardt sat in a hollowed-out farmhouse reading the new directive. All surviving armor was to reposition at least 1 kilometer behind the line. No forward deployment. No direct support. He read it again, not believing it. Keep the tanks behind the infantry. How had the war changed so fast? He walked outside into the snow. Off in the distance, the fog rolled again. Somewhere out there was another squad, another pair of hands, another pipe with a warhead. He stared into the dark and realized something terrifying. They didn't even need tanks to win anymore. The snow had thickened along the Roer River line. Villages crumbled beneath it, smoke rising in columns that curled into low, frozen clouds. Trees cracked under artillery echo, not from impact, but from the weight of pressure. The 12th Volksgrenadier Division had dug in around a small crossroads near Inden. Convinced their trench network and reinforced machine gun nests could repel anything short of an armored battalion. They had underestimated the Americans again. Not because the Yanks brought tanks, but because they didn't need them. Private First Class Jimmy Ward moved with a quiet rhythm now. His squad advanced with confidence. 2 men with rifles on the flanks, 1 bar covering the approach, and Ward with the bazooka in the middle like a silent axe waiting to swing. They didn't rush, they didn't panic. They knew what they could do. A week ago, they had taken a 3-gun pillbox outside Lammersdorf with nothing but rockets and grenades. The first round from Ward cracked the aperture. The second silenced the machine gun. The third was never needed. The bunker surrendered before anyone else had to die. Word had spread fast. The Germans were no longer just falling back. They were afraid. At a command dugout inside the Inden perimeter, Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Kruger read through casualty reports with a pen shaking in his fingers. He had expected losses from artillery, from strafing, from mines. But most of the field reports came back with the same words scribbled again and again in blocky, panicked handwriting. Infanterie Rakete. Durchschlag durch Beton. Bazooka direkt. Direct. 1 round, 1 man, and a defensive position that had withstood everything before it was simply gone. He crushed the edge of the paper between thumb and forefinger. How could it be this easy? They had spent months reinforcing those bunkers, weeks laying wire and burying the flanks with overlapping fields of fire. And it was undone by a man in a muddy coat with a metal pipe. American scouts had already marked the 3 bunkers ahead of Ward's unit. They sat on a hillline overlooking a ruined schoolhouse, their slits dark and silent but deadly. German MGs had killed 3 runners trying to cross the open 60-yard stretch the day before. Today would be different. Sergeant Mills crawled next to Ward behind a splintered hay cart. "Take the left," he whispered. "Soon as we fire, the boys push up." Ward nodded. His heart wasn't even pounding anymore. Not like before, it was steady, focused. He braced the tube against the cart, sighted the black slit just right of a concrete beam. Fired. The rocket screamed through snow-swirled air and hit square. The flash was instantaneous, orange and white, a pressurized detonation that blew the metal barrel off the roof and punched smoke and fire from the front like a dragon's cough. A second squad fired right, another bazooka round exploding against the side of the next bunker. Before the snow settled, the American squads were moving. Garens cracked, bars opened. German return fire faltered, then stopped. Inside the bunker, Feldwebel Reinhard lay on his back, bleeding from his ears. His machine gunner had been flung across the room like a rag doll, his loader coughing blood from crushed ribs. The gun still sat mounted, untouched, but the men were broken. He tried to move. His legs didn't respond. Only his head turned, enough to see the hole in the wall, jagged, glowing at the edges. That was not from artillery. That was personal. And it had come from less than 50 yards away. When Kruger heard the position had fallen in under 5 minutes, he didn't believe it. He demanded confirmation, demanded names. They brought back helmets, tags. But what chilled him more was the note scrawled on a captured field map in English. 2 tubes, 7 men, 1 street. That's all it had taken. The next day, reports came in from Düren. Several bunkers overrun not by airstrike, but by ground assault with infantry-fired heat. Tankers began requesting to ride at night. Some refused to leave staging points at all until roads were cleared. The stories weren't just rumors anymore. They were field doctrine. The bazooka wasn't a threat, it was a fact. Ward sat in the corner of a blasted barn that night, cleaning the launch tube like it was a rifle. The fins of the last 2 rockets lay in the snow outside, melted slightly where they'd landed after impact. He wasn't proud of it, but he knew what it meant. They were rewriting the battlefield. 1 squad at a time. Eberhardt rejoined his unit 3 days later, reassigned to a different company after the rout at Gressenich. His new position was a crossroad defense with a pair of PAK-40s and a command car that didn't even have working radios. He found the junior officer assigned to him leaning against a fence post, smoking. "We've got 6 men and a half-track that doesn't move," the officer said. Eberhard looked at the shallow trenches, the overturned cart they'd placed as makeshift cover. "How do we hold this?" he asked. The officer took a drag. "We don't." He pointed toward a nearby signpost riddled with bullet holes. Someone had scratched into the wood in rough English. "We bring rockets, run if you can." The following evening, a forward observer with the 102nd Infantry watched as a German tank pulled a full U-turn on the main road at the first sight of movement in the hedgerows. No bazooka had fired. None had even been spotted. But the Germans knew. The Americans had them. And if they stayed, they'd burn. By the time the Americans reached the Roer River, it was no longer a matter of terrain. It was fear. Every German position behind the riverbanks knew what was coming, not in the form of tanks or massed bombers. Those were the old threats. What they feared now was quieter, smaller, closer. The infantry. Not just with rifles and grenades, but with firepower once thought impossible to carry by hand. And worst of all, they were everywhere. In the ruins outside Linisch, Lieutenant Hans Eberhard crouched behind the broken remnants of a wall that had once belonged to a carpenter's shop. He was bleeding from the ear. The remnants of his command, 3 riflemen, 1 radioman, no functioning vehicles, were scattered behind splintered buildings, waiting for the next rocket to come. He hadn't seen a tank in 4 days, not since the last Panzer in his sector was cracked open by a bazooka at 30 paces. The Americans hadn't even fired first. They'd waited until the tank committed to a turn. Then they struck. Like wolves. Private First Class Jimmy Ward was filthy. His gloves were stiff with dried mud and gun oil, his boots half frozen, and his shoulder was sore from a near miss that had hurled him into a tree the night before. But he still had 4 rockets left. He and Corporal Levin moved slowly down a frozen canal path, watching the edge of the tree line for glints of steel or the shimmer of exhaust. They weren't hunting armor anymore. They were hunting fear. Every time they fired, a machine gun position fell quiet. Every time they stepped out of cover and raised the tube, the German line rippled. On the 3rd day of the Roer crossings, a squad from Ward's platoon approached an abandoned farmhouse near Hottorf. They moved slowly. There had been signs of occupation, tin cans, stove heat, blood. The door was barricaded from the inside. The squad surrounded it, rifles up. Then came a sound they didn't expect. A bang muffled and then footsteps. The door opened. 3 Germans stepped out with hands raised, their weapons slung behind them. One pointed at the side of the building and spoke in broken English. "Boom," he said, pointing to the crumbled wall. "Your tube." Ward looked. A hole had been punched clean through the stone foundation. The edge was still scorched. No one had fired on that house. No order had been given. But the rumor of bazookas was enough. That's all it took now. By late February, the American advance west of Cologne had changed shape entirely. Tank destroyer battalions were pulled back. Engineers pushed ahead. Bazooka teams were embedded directly into recon units, with standing orders to break resistance at the squad level. Commanders no longer waited for artillery. They simply pointed and said, "Clear that." And someone with a launcher would nod and disappear into the smoke. On the German side, tank battalions reported increasing refusals. Veteran crews balked at being sent into towns. One commander filed a blunt report. Armor is no longer advantage in urban sectors. Infantry-carried shaped charge devices are rendering forward presence suicidal. They knew the Americans had something. They still didn't know how many. The truth was enough. At the southern edge of the Ruhr pocket, Eberhardt's new orders came. Fall back to Dusseldorf. He read the dispatch under candlelight, his breath fogging in the icy bunker air. Fall back. There were no more roads to defend, no more ridgelines to anchor armor. Everything forward of the Rhine was becoming a graveyard of steel. And none of it was burning from air raids or tank duels. It was being picked apart by men with launchers the weight of a rifle. They didn't just kill tanks. They killed positions. They killed plans. They killed doctrine. Eberhard folded the paper. He no longer believed the war was winnable. When Cologne finally fell and American infantry walked beneath the bombed-out spires of the cathedral, the bazookas were still there, not slung casually, not discarded. Still ready. Even in victory, they were needed. Because rumors spread fast, and though the Germans were broken, not all were done fighting. A few tanks still lingered in the east. Some SS units had dug into old fortresses. But none of them would hold for long. The infantry had changed. They no longer hid behind armor. They were the armor. Weeks later, Jimmy Ward crossed the Rhine. He carried the same launcher he'd used outside Gressenich. Its paint was chipped, the grips were cracked, one of the aiming sights was gone. He didn't need it anymore. He could feel the weight, the distance, the trajectory. He didn't love the weapon, but he respected it. Because it had allowed him, and thousands like him, to fight machines with nothing but grit and steel. And win. Behind him, in the shattered valleys of the Ardennes and the Siegfried Line, the wrecks of German tanks sat rotting under snow. Many were untouched by artillery. Many had no shell holes in the front. But near the side skirts, near the engine decks, near the corners of pillboxes and bunker walls, scorched holes told the story. 6 pounds of shaped explosive. Shoulder-fired. Delivered by hand. And no one had seen it coming.